Everyone, welcome to this panel on Scholars Day, and we're looking forward to hearing presentations on two separate papers. I don't know if anybody has a preference as to which one of you would like to go first, but the titles of our papers are An Environmentalist's Economy, Why Positive Game Economies Appeal to the Modern Gamer by Kierstin Marchal, and also Puritanism and Power by Emily Mullins.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kierstin Marchal. I'm a geography major here at UNT in the Honors College, and today I'm going to talk about a really pressing topic for our modern world, which is sustainable development, but not in real life, in virtual life. The paper I'm presenting today isn't a typical research paper. As opposed to creating an experiment and testing out the results, I synthesized my experience, of which I have a considerable amount, with two video games, along with economic theory and journalist analysis to develop a framework for analyzing the in-game economies of these two games. In my paper, An Environmentalist Economy, Why Positive Game Economies Appeal to the Modern Gamer, I covered two modern video games: Nintendo's 2020 casual life simulator, Animal Crossing: New Horizons, and the independent 2016 farming simulator, Stardew Valley. Animal Crossing: New Horizons was an immediate hit when it came out, partially attributed to the COVID-19 quarantines, which started about the same time it was released, meaning that people couldn't go outside and the new game was out. It follows a similar path to other games in the Animal Crossing series, but with a few important distinctions. For anyone unfamiliar with it, Animal Crossing is a role-playing game, or RPG, where the player joins a small town populated with cute animals who all want to be their neighbors. There's no set plotline for any Animal Crossing game, but the player has multiple options for how to spend their time: growing trees and flowers, catching bugs and fish, either to display at the museum or to sell for bells, the in-game currency, building friendships, and increasing the size of their house. The final objective is the most difficult long-term goal for most Animal Crossing games, and one given to the player immediately. Your house is built on credit by local shopkeeper Tom Nook, pictured on the left, and you have to work for him usually at the beginning of the game to start to pay off the loan that he gives you. For any future upgrades, you have to pay, not with working. Items typically sell for 100 to a few thousand bells in game, and a typical mortgage is from 1.5 to 7.5 million bells, meaning that you have to have a lot of time, energy, and money to pay off all of these loans. Because the game almost relies entirely on player set goals, this is one of the largest ones that you have to focus on. And it makes up most of Animal Crossing's zero-sum game economy. There are winners and losers for every transaction. As Ian Bogost notes in his article about Animal Crossing, Tom Nook introduces the player into a debt loop. The more items a player buys, the more space they need to share those items, and the more items they want to fill the space. It's a zero-sum game. Tom Nook is the winner, and the player is the loser. New Horizons, however, has three key differences from this zero-sum game system. First, like its previous installment, 2012's New Leaf, New Horizons allows players to garden their landscapes but develop them. 2, lampposts, playgrounds, even monuments can be built into the player's small town. Second, players can extract natural resources from their surroundings. You can get wood from trees, stone and iron from rocks, and even clam to make fishing bait. Players can create tools and furniture for themselves, like fishing rods, rather than buying them from Tom Nook. Finally, he no longer introduces the player to a debt cycle. Instead of paying bells for a house, you pay with Nook miles, which are something that you get from playing the game as you always would, which includes talking to your neighbors, catching some bugs, cutting down a tree, and more. In Animal Crossing: New Horizons, the player is still free to participate or not participate in any bell-based economy. Home loans are an option, but so is living in a free tent, making your own tools and furniture, and exchanging with other villagers for the items that you can't receive. And the environment you source these materials from? Infinitely replenishing. Wood and stone renew themselves daily, while catchable fish and bugs renew every few minutes. New Horizons gives the means of production to the player and promotes small businesses who give you benefits for shopping with them, like the Able Sisters, who give you tickets for free items just for helping them with small tasks. This is a positive sum game economy. Every transaction has two winners because both sides benefit from interacting. Stardew Valley offers a different kind of game experience and a different kind of game economy. It opens with a player character exhausted with their life at the extremely boring Joja Corporation, moving to their grandfather's old farm. It's a fixer-upper. It definitely takes a lot of time and effort to make this into something productive and beautiful that you can sustain yourself from. And you can see there's the difference from the first year to the fourth year in game. It takes a lot of effort to do this. Early on in the game, the player is faced with a choice. There's an old abandoned building in the center of town, which is overrun by forest spirits called Junimos. The player can either choose to help them rebuild it back into a community center that the people can enjoy and spend time in, or you can buy a membership to the Georgia Corporation and turn that building into a warehouse. Both choices involve the player working in order to better the town. Your objectives all work on community development, including repairing mine carts, the bridge to the quarry, or even the local bus system, which helps get people jobs. But the way these goals are achieved is different. For the community center, if the player chooses to help the Junimos, they must bring specific bundles of crops, minerals, foraged materials, and fish in order to unlock all these milestones. It takes at least 1 year in-game time to do this and costs 57 to 78,000 gold approximately. If the player chooses to help Jojico and build the warehouse, they have to just pay for these milestones instead. They're still helping the local community, but you can choose to specialize in this route, say to focus on fishing instead of having to develop a wide range of skills from mining, foraging, or agriculture. The total cost for the warehouse is 140,000, which is twice the cost it is if you choose to help the Junimos. The cost differential actually, it increases dramatically if you choose to add an additional movie theater to the town, which is something that the residents enjoy. Total cost is 640,000 for the Jojimar route versus 60 to 90,000 for the Junima route, which is an 8.5 times difference. This cost differential isn't the only reason the game subtly pushes you towards helping the Junimos and developing the town economy. Despite the game stating otherwise, products at Jojimart are actually more expensive than the products at the local general store, usually by 25%, but sometimes exorbitantly more expensive, and their stock is more limited. This isn't fully realistic, and in a real economy, a corporation would be offering lower prices and more diverse stock options than a small business. It does help encourage the player to engage with their local economy. And on that topic, every business in town besides Jojico is owned individually or by a family, and only 4 of the characters are employees of other organizations. The blacksmith, the local general store, the saloon, and the carpenter are all individually owned businesses. While you're the customer for their goods, they're also the customer for your goods. You sell items to them and you can buy items in return, each offering what you can in order to develop a perfect positive sum game. You're both benefiting from every interaction. Stardew Valley also has a similar environmental paradise setting as Animal Crossing New Horizons. Trees regrow within a season, one replenishes every day, and crops only take a few days to develop. Beyond this, the farmer's methods are all sustainable. Your animals are happier when they're free range, crops can be grown in season only outside of the greenhouse, and fertilizers are made using fish and tree sap instead of chemicals. There's no reliance on environmentally harmful industrial farming practices in Stardew Valley. There are only sustainable and organic methods. Though Animal Crossing, New Horizons and Stardew Valley both have positive STEM game economies, they also have important differences. At its core, New Horizons is about player customization, building the perfect house, finding the clothes and furniture that you want, and developing the friendships that you want. You can spend a lot of money on a mortgage, which really only helps the player, but it is one of the longest long-term goals. Stardew Valley is squarely focused on developing a sustainable business economy and the world around you. The player engages in this small business economy and sustainable farming practices in order to develop the town in ways that are beneficial to everyone and not just themselves. Item collection in the game is limited, so player customization isn't really an option here. Despite these differences, both use a positive sum game economy to emotionally fulfill players. In a world where neoliberal capitalism dominates, the world's riches are in the hands of a few, and almost everyone else is working just to stay alive. Modern economies can leave workers feeling isolated and replaceable, which is how the player feels at Jojimart at the beginning of the game, seen here. Being able to escape to a world where everything you buy helps to support a small business and everything you sell is sustainably sourced allows players for peace of mind not available to people in real life. Instead of perpetually being a loser in the zero-sum game, Animal Crossing New Horizons and Stardew Valley offer a world where everyone benefits from every transaction and the world isn't hurt when doing so. In the video game industry, realism is typically praised, but these games' unreality is what makes them so compelling. By offering an idealized world to escape to, they may just offer a model for how we improve our real economy outside of consoles. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kierstin. Okay, and now Emily Mullins with Puritanism and Power.
Hi there, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, awesome. So good
Yes.
morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to hear me present my research, which is very vaguely titled Puritanism and Power. And it is a project that I conjured up in the spring of 2020 under the guidance of one of my favorite professors, Dr. Tomlin, who is here with us today. And the main goal of the project is to prove that increased dissent from Puritanism between 1630 and 1750 set the stage for social revolution. And to achieve this, I examine the accounts of individuals, communities, and a broader view of the historical significance of congregational religion. And so to really dive into this project, I split my research into two major areas. One of them focused on changing cultures in New England and within both the individual and the community, and the other on changing power dynamics. And on the topic of the individual, in the earliest years of Massachusetts history, personal identity was most commonly found within a person's faith. And this was exacerbated by Puritan ideology. Entire communities revolved around their theology and their religious practice. And it was quite literally this city on a hill. Churches were put at the center of towns because that was the most important thing to them. And so we actually have a lot of examples to support this. Most famously are the stories of people like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, but also other dissidents like John Rogers, who had openly criticized the Puritan Church and denounced the power of church leaders. And then also in 1674, Reverend Joshua Moody, who was tried for including themes of political dissent in his sermons. So to say the least, the Puritan Church really did not like that. And so we know that Massachusetts has been labeled a place of dissent throughout American history, specifically in regards to the American Revolution. But clearly the actions of these dissenters, based on the fact that it was so strictly anti-authority, it existed long before the First Great Awakening, and therefore the actions and changing mindsets of religious individuals paved the way for change within entire communities. And this was going to occur not only up in the Northeast, but also all the way down the American colonies. And so as change overtook entire religious communities, power dynamics reformed as well. Historian Barbara Falk said, and I quote, "Modern dissent has at least three overlapping origin stories: consolidation of the post-Westphalian state, religious dissent, and the ensuing debate on toleration, and a one step forward, two steps back, and violent emergence of liberalism." The early laws of Massachusetts communities were strictly rooted in Old Testament scripture and allowed for very little religious deviation at the core of society, which is strange considering the tolerance that Puritans claimed to have upon their settlement. And actually their laws mimicked English common law. And so they basically instated exactly what they were trying to get away from in the first place, which was an overbearing, religiously intolerant clergy. And so all of this trouble between individuals and the religious leaders in their community led up to one major breaking point, right? It's the Great Awakening. And it emerged as an event blended by the overlap in political and religious identity. There was this general fear of authority, and the sudden rise of anti-intellectual sentiment is largely a result of generational attrition, fueled by questioning the legitimacy of power held by Puritan elites. So this moment of total dissent, this revivalism, is astounding, promoting the righteousness of personal autonomy, especially in a religious setting that was becoming increasingly politicized. The idea of true religion revolved around a personal connection with God rather than the emphasis on rituals and rules that came with traditional Puritanism. Essentially, the Great Awakening became this large decentralization movement created by dissenters to create a new personal interpretation of religious text that would support a tolerant religious society within the context of their government, which focused on local power. and also anti-corruption. The intellectual elite in the Puritan church, the preachers who also acted as their political leaders, from the beginning only expressed one single intellectual narrative, and it existed only to reinforce the pre-existing hierarchy that kept them in power for so long. So this moment where free will and religion and politics met, it encouraged personal autonomy on both the front of religion and early politics, and that is what we describe as the democratization of Christianity, though specifically that Christianity is Puritanism in this case. And obviously, we're going to see some new characters who spearheaded that movement, and these are names we know, we've learned them since like 8th grade, but it's George Whitfield, Jonathan Edwards, Gilbert Tennant, and so all of these major itinerant preachers. But Whitfield actually made a driving point in the anti-authority ideology. He suggested that the clergy's topical knowledge of religious texts was not enough for salvation. It's the idea that spurred the itinerant preachers of the Great Awakening to continue their escapade to spread the word of personal salvation. And all of that is not to say that these men were angels. Rather, a few contradictions did exist in their methodology. As they grew in popularity and prominence, they gained significant amounts of power, especially as political figureheads relied on their influence to boost their public image. And so the political power these men are gaining, that circles right back to the democratization of Christianity. Because we do have to question whether the motivations of these preachers were selfless or intentionally working in the favor of their own personal gain, because they had significant power over the public as time went on, whether or not the public recognized it. But we can see that there is a very clear schism in the church, and that's what we describe as the split between old light and new light ideology. These new lights, the itinerant preachers, and everyone that they managed to get on board with revivalism, they targeted a younger, easily excitable crowd who had a desire to escape the propriety of reason that followed the Age of Enlightenment. They championed the idea of acceptance of sins, yet rebirth from them through personal salvation and a relationship with the Almighty. For the first time, you didn't need a formal education to be declared truly holy. So therefore, salvation was attainable for anyone, regardless of if they could read the Bible and translate it. On the other hand, old light stuck to traditional Puritan dogma, fearing that it would be jeopardized and lose the status of a godly society or their city on a hill mentality. And they were just terrified of radical liberalism that emerged during the Great Awakening. And quite frankly, they were scrambling to retain membership in the dawn of a mass revival. And I'm getting my 3-minute warning. I promise I'm wrapping up. But I have to mention that throughout the earliest years of American colonization, there was fighting against internal corruption of institutional religion. And this led to declaration of the righteousness of personal autonomy, both in the religious and political landscapes. The entire process of this this basically was an extended Protestant Reformation, and it is completely unique to English America. But so we have our 2 major factors, which is changing methods of religiosity and a culture of dissent in New England. The biggest question here is, why does this matter? I've asked myself that too a lot, because this research kicked my butt when I did it. But I've come to determine through the research that the Great Awakening promoted self-determination of both religion and politics as the two became directly intertwined, destroying the reliance on institutions and using the concept of free will as the democratization of personal choice. This pattern is the framework of the American Revolution and also American patriotism even to this day. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the research I've done. Sorry the visuals didn't work. That kind of threw a wrench in everything, but that's okay.
That's perfectly okay. It was that was absolutely wonderful. Okay, so we'll now open it up for a few minutes of Q&A with Emily and Kierstin after that. So questions for Emily.
I have a question. So what similarities do you see in these preachers from the Great Awakening era towards kind of the modern era today, in terms of like political involvement, like the televangelists, for instance?
I was actually gonna directly bring up televangelists because, you know, we see their direct influence on politics, considering that they are sometimes even aired on politically leaning news networks. Um, and, you know, they're targeting very excitable crowds, maybe not always the youngest ones, but they're also focusing on a point in time where a lot of people have turned away from the church. And, you know, every single century we have seen its own religious revival. And that does lead me to wonder, like, are we currently going through one? You know, will we see one coming up soon? But yeah, starting in the 1950s, that was its own religious revival with televangelism. And who knows where that's going, so.
Okay, wonderful. Anyone else? Jim, yes.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. As somebody who has an academic interest in your area of study, let me ask this question. That behind the Great Awakening, relative to an emerging democratization of this country, do you see any link between congregational autonomy, even of the 17th century, and congregational separatism in Plymouth, with 18th century movements toward independence?
Yes, I do. So the entire idea of separatism, you know, the entire American Revolution was a movement of dissent against the English, and we can see direct roots of congregational religion within the American Revolution. Every single like battalion had their own religious preacher, regardless of the denominations of the people fighting, might I add. But there are significant ties between congregationalism and the American Revolution. But I didn't follow that path as much as I should have or wanted to.
No, it's not a matter of should. It's just a matter of, let's say, parallel universes where there are precedents for something. And I can't help but be reminded that before the American Revolution, Edmund Burke, and this pertains directly to one of your, to several of your utterances about dissent, warned the Parliament that they wouldn't, if you pursue the colonies, you're not going to win this one, because, and this is a part quote, maybe a little paraphrase, they are the Puritans of the Puritans and the Protestants of the Protestants, and they are the dissidents of dissent. You're not going to win. These people are too accustomed to protesting and to dissent. So, but what a pleasure to hear somebody navigate these waters with such facility at such a young age. Man, but anyway, that's what I have to say.
I appreciate it. It's gonna be what I pursue at SMU next year, actually. So it's really nice to hear.
That's great.
Okay, well, yeah, fantastic. Okay, and now a few, if we could have some questions for Kierstin about her work.
All right. So, Kierstin, I really was educated because I'm not myself doing various video games, let alone ecologically helpful video games. and sustainable at that. So what occurred to me was the question, gee, this is really educational. Do you think that our public policy makers would do well to either not necessarily play those specific games, but could there be computer programs that would better educate people in the area of constructive public policy? And maybe that way we would have a better communities, a better world. I don't know the answer to this. This is kind of your generation's between AI, computer games. So what are some of your thinking about how this could influence public policy?
I do honestly think that some public policy would be good to be based on this, specifically in the realm of promoting small businesses, because it's something that, you know, as a generation, we're really kind of tired of working for the man, as they say. It's an exhausting thing to have to work to create profits for billionaires and things. So like working at corporations is kind of exhausting. And for people who are in public policy, there's a lot of them who don't have a lot of that experience where they're working things like minimum wage jobs. So to kind of see like a small business oriented economy where people are producing things and selling them to each other rather than to large corporations, I think would be helpful to see, but also because they're just very peaceful and they're nice. And it's nice to be able to see a world where if you're prioritizing treating the environment well and interacting with others like small businesses rather than just churning out profits endlessly, I think it would help create a better world.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that response.
And in the field of educational games, there's been, you know, a push by various research centers and also people doing game design and public policy. They're video games that model, for example, humanitarian responses to like Ebola and things like that, and like the Red Cross has done some of this, you know, where they've gamified, you know, certain things out, right? You know, I've got a lot to say about this, and I will not. I will stop. Does anybody else have any questions for Kierstin? Because I have one.
Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. Cesar and then Krista. Go ahead. Yes. Go ahead.
My question was going to be, you know, since the pandemic started, you know, a lot of people were locked in playing Animal Crossing. And my question is, like, do you believe that with all that time that people spent in that like ideal virtual world, if that if that gives them a stronger desire to, once they're out, to really participate in the same activities that they were doing in the virtual world, to kind of bring that ideal image into ours?
I think it definitely might. I know personally I've started gardening a lot more since the pandemic began, which is something that, I mean, you can do in Animal Crossing. Like obviously there's so many flowers that you can grow and trees that you can plant. So I honestly do think, just because we've kind of gotten used to this, obviously we can't just live on beautiful secluded islands full of gorgeous beaches and fruit trees and everything, but I think when we come back, we probably will prioritize talking to our neighbors and taking care of little gardens more, just because it's something that we've kind of gotten used to, but also it's something that's proved like pretty therapeutic for a lot of people, especially since we can't leave the house. So yeah, I do think so.
My question was very similar to Cesar's, so I'll go ahead and let Marshall ask his question.
Okay, so one of the things that, about one of the other, I guess that as you were talking, Kierstin, one of the things that I wanted to ask about was the narrative in Stardew Valley. I mean, it presents this idea, you know, of returning to and my daughter is a big fan of Stardew Valley, and I haven't played it that much, but the fabula begins with that you return to your grandfather's farm to take it over, and then essentially like, reconstruct and remake, the family homestead. And then from there, in, building, in building this economy, you also get to know a lot about, it's like your relationships with your neighbors, but there's this whole other backstory that doesn't exist in Animal Crossing with it's the narrative of how this community got in, how it declined. And I was wondering if you could comment on that and how that plays into things.
What I think is really interesting is that, yeah, Stardew Valley does have definitely a more developed plot line and kind of pushes you towards doing certain things. Animal Crossing is very much just, you choose what you do. It's talking to people, it's catching bugs, but it's not much more than that. And for Stardew Valley, the idea is that you're coming back to basically your roots, but you're also helping fix things between the town. Like a lot of the people don't talk to each other. Some of them are really washed up, and they do have some serious problems in there, like alcoholism, which is mentioned briefly, but I won't go into that because it's not that related. But like by developing the community center, which is one of the things that you can do, like you see that a lot of people will just end up going there, like the townspeople will end up going there and spending their time creating things. Everyone seems a lot happier. Like you can make sure, like by choosing to develop the general store, you can the community center, you can ensure that the general store is open for another day a week, which is, it usually is 6 days and then it's 7 days, because that's how it operates. Like if they have more business, they get to be open more, which is great for you because then you don't have to worry about like, I can't sell anything on Wednesday. So a lot of it kind of does push you to this concept of like, you want to do better because it benefits you personally. You're able to get around faster. You're able to use the mine carts to travel to the mines. It's very helpful, but it's also helpful in the game sense because like by repairing like the bus lines, you give a job to one of the villagers who hasn't really had a job because the bus has been broken. And like, what are you going to do if your job is being a bus driver and the bus is broken? So the narrative kind of pushes you in order to develop the community and help everyone else at the same time that you're like benefiting yourself. Like you are both kind of escaping this kind of path of bleak future that you have when you're working as like a nameless corporation employee and developing something for yourself that you can be proud of, which is your farm and your family legacy, and you're also helping other people at the same time. Animal Crossing kind of just lets you make your own choices about what you're going to do. It does have like a positive sum game economy in the background, but it is a lot about player choice. Stardew Valley is definitely more about specifically cultivating this world so that you can see how much better it gets if you engage positively.
Okay. And I kept, just as a final, maybe perhaps tending towards the end of things on this panel, I kept trying to think about connections between both of these things since we were talking about them together. And since I am teaching a class on games and narrative that I've kept coming back to, especially in the digital game experience, that there's the mechanic that's outlined in Stardew Valley, which is something that's based on this positive sort of community building experience, right? That it's not that it also kind of appeals to, and especially these games that deal with American history, that they are about this kind of like primal sort of Edenic American experience where, sort of in building a culture that it's based on this concept of, just a few hundred people living together and, as it were, like tending and befriending one another, right? And then kind of that's like the beginning of how culture grows from there. Okay. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions or observations?
I would just like to commend both the students and obviously the faculty mentors who have inspired them, and then really devoted colleagues like Marshall who have agreed to moderate and our wonderful staff members who, like Krista and Valerie, who help us present all this and make it cohere electronically and thematically with their own comments. So kudos to all. What a great session this was. Bravo, bravo.
Okay. Yes, wonderful. All right. I think that's about it for this panel. And thank you all for coming. Wonderful questions and input. And have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And congratulations on SMU. That's wonderful.
Thank you. I'm
Right,
very
yes,
excited.
That's fantastic.
Program.
It's a great place and very supportive. And you'll find a lot of resources there. Yeah.
I'm going to be the youngest person in their PhD program on arriving, so that's going to be fascinating. That's going to be very new for me. So
yeah.
But I'm excited.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Great. Okay.
Have a good one.
Okay, you too.
Thanks, Marshall.
Okay.
Thank you.